September 1916. The Somme Valley. A German soldier crouches in the trench, his hands trembling as he grips the cold steel of his rifle. Above him, the sky screams with artillery fire shells exploding in waves, each detonation sending cascades of earth and metal fragments raining down. He waits for the whistle, for the order that will send him over the parapet into that hellish landscape where the air itself seems made of shrapnel. When the moment comes, he rises, and for 3 seconds his head is visible above the trench line. That is all it takes. A shell fragment, no larger than a man's thumb, tears through the air at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second and strikes him in the face. He falls backward, his hands instinctively reaching for what remains, finding only wet tissue and bone where moments before there had been a jaw, a mouth. The features that made him recognizable as human dot. This was the arithmetic of modern war. The Great War did not merely kill, it transformed the very nature of human injury. Between 1914 and 1918, an estimated 280,000 combatants from all sides suffered catastrophic facial wounds. The French medical corps documented that approximately 15% of all battlefield injuries resulted in facial disfigurement, a proportion unprecedented in military history. In France alone, of the 4.2 million wounded soldiers, some 300,000 were classified as permanently mutilated, and of these, approximately 15,000 bore injuries so severe they became known by a term that would haunt a generation: gueules, cassées, the broken faces. The Industrial Revolution had reached the battlefield, and with it came weapons designed not merely to kill, but to obliterate. Machine guns fired 600 rounds per minute. Artillery shells weighing hundreds of pounds exploded with such force they created craters 30 feet deep. High explosive munitions fragmented into thousands of metal shards, each one a potential instrument of disfigurement. The nature of trench warfare itself created the conditions for this epidemic of facial trauma. Soldiers spent months living in narrow ditches carved into the earth, their bodies protected by walls of sandbags and timber, but their heads necessarily exposed whenever they looked over the parapet to observe enemy positions or prepare for assault. The German soldier in the photograph, like tens of thousands of others, had learned too late that 3 seconds of exposure was 3 seconds too long. Military physicians had not anticipated this. In earlier wars, the Napoleonic campaigns, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian conflict, facial wounds occurred, but they represented a small fraction of total casualties, and most men who suffered them died quickly from blood loss or infection. The introduction of the steel helmet in 1915 changed this calculus in ways that would prove both merciful and cruel. The French Adrian helmet appeared first, followed by the British Brodie and the German Stahlhelm in 1916. These helmets reduced fatal head injuries by 75%, a triumph of protective engineering. But this reduction in mortality meant that soldiers who might have died instantly from shrapnel to the skull now survived with their skulls intact but their faces destroyed, their jaws shattered, their noses and cheeks blown away, their eyes sockets empty or grotesquely displaced. One senior French medical advisor complained, perhaps with the callousness born of overwhelming numbers, that the introduction of the helmet was ill-advised because it extended the survival time of those wounded in the head and neck, clogging the casualty clearance system with men who would never fully recover. These men returned to a world unprepared to receive them. The German soldier in the photograph, we do not know his name. Only his injury came home to find that the face he had possessed, the face his mother had kissed, the face that marked him as an individual among millions, was gone. In its place was a landscape of scar tissue and exposed anatomy, a sight so disturbing to civilians accustomed to orderly appearances that society created mechanisms of avoidance. In Britain, disfigured soldiers were called the loneliest Tommies. And when they left hospital grounds, they were instructed to sit on specially designated bright blue benches, a visual signal to passers-by that they should avert their eyes. The men wore blue hospital uniforms with the same objective: to warn the public of their approach, to give civilians time to look away, to cross the street, to shield children from the sight. Medical historian Lindsay Fitzharris documented the social response. This was a time when losing a limb made you a hero, but losing a face made you a monster. The psychological consequences were predictable and devastating. Inspector Robert Tate Mackenzie, who visited convalescent hospitals during the war, reported that many facially wounded veterans became victims of despondency, of melancholia, leading in some cases even to suicide. In France, Colonel Yves Picot, himself a gueule cassé, was refused entry to a gathering for war-disabled veterans. His disfigurement deemed too disturbing for the comfort of men who had lost arms or legs but retained their faces. The rejection catalyzed a movement. In 1921, Picot and others founded the Union des Blesses, de la face et de la tête, the association of those wounded in the face and the head, to advocate for men whom the state had initially deemed ineligible for veterans' benefits on the grounds that facial disfigurement did not constitute disability. The organization fought not merely for pensions, but for recognition of a fundamental truth, that identity itself resides in the face, and that to lose one's face is to lose one's place in the human community. Yet from this catastrophe emerged innovation. At the outbreak of war in 1914, plastic surgery as a medical discipline scarcely existed. There were scattered precedent skin grafts attempted in ancient India, Renaissance surgeons who performed rudimentary rhinoplasty, 19th century experiments with tissue transplantation, but no systematic methodology, no body of knowledge that could address injuries of the scale and complexity produced by modern artillery. The war created both the need and the laboratory. In Britain, a surgeon named Harold Gillies, initially trained in ear, nose, and throat medicine, recognized that conventional surgical approaches were inadequate. In 1915, he convinced the Army Medical Services to establish a specialized facility at Queen's Hospital in Sidcup, dedicated entirely to facial reconstruction. There, between 1917 and 1925, Gillies performed more than 11,000 operations on approximately 5,000 patients, each case a unique puzzle requiring creativity, technical skill, and a deep understanding of both anatomy and psychology. Gillies pioneered techniques that remain foundational to modern reconstructive surgery. He developed the tubed pedicle flappa method of transplanting skin from the chest or forehead to the face by creating a tube of flesh that remained attached at both ends, maintaining blood supply while the tissue gradually integrated into its new location. He emphasized the principle of replacing like with like, using tissues that matched as closely as possible the texture and appearance of what had been lost. He understood that reconstruction required not merely the restoration of function, the ability to eat, to speak, to breathe, but also the restoration of form, of appearance sufficient to allow a man to walk down a street without provoking horror. In his 1920 monograph, Plastic Surgery of the Face, Gillies documented his methods with clinical precision, including detailed illustrations of surgical procedures and case studies that would guide surgeons for decades. In Germany, Jacques Joseph, a surgeon who had established a reputation before the war for pioneering work in rhinoplasty, turned his skills toward military necessity. Joseph, born Jakob Lewin Joseph to a Jewish family in Berlin, had spent years developing techniques for aesthetic surgery, driven by the conviction that cosmetic improvement, while not a physical necessity, was worth the risks to a person's health because of its positive impact on their spirit and personality. When war began, Joseph was appointed to the reserve medical staff, and as casualties mounted, he found himself confronting injuries that dwarfed anything in his previous experience. The German High Command took notice of his extraordinary success rates. In 1915, Kaiser Wilhelm II personally offered Joseph the chair for plastic surgery at the Karite Hospital in Berlin, but only on the condition that Joseph convert from Judaism to Christianity. Joseph refused. 1 year later, without the requirement of religious conversion, the Prussian Ministry for Ecclesiastical and Educational Matters established a Department of Facial Plastic Surgery for Joseph at the Karite, though the position carried no salary. There, Joseph performed reconstructive surgery using regional flaps from the forehead and upper arm, free cartilage transplants, and bone grafts, achieving results that earned him the Iron Cross for military service. But surgery, however skilled, had limits. Some injuries were simply too extensive for reconstruction with the techniques available. Entire sections of faces had been destroyed, noses blown away completely, jaws shattered beyond repair, eye sockets empty or deformed, massive tissue loss that no graft could adequately replace. For these men, a different solution emerged from an unexpected quarter, the artist's studio. In London, sculptor Francis Derwent Wood established what became known as the Tin Noses Shop, where he created prosthetic masks for soldiers whose faces could not be surgically restored. In Paris, American sculptor Anna Coleman Ladd founded the American Red Cross Studio for portrait masks, applying her artistic training to the creation of custom facial prosthetics. Soldiers came to Ladd's studio on the Rue Notre Dame des Champs to have casts made of their damaged faces. Ladd would reference pre-injury photographs if available, sculpting the missing features in clay or plasticine with meticulous attention to individual characteristics. A final prosthetic was constructed from extremely thin galvanized copper or silver, light enough to be worn but strong enough to maintain shape. The metal was painted with hard enamel to approximate the recipient's skin tone, and real hair was used to create eyebrows, eyelashes, and mustaches. The prosthetic was secured to the face with strings or eyeglasses, and the lips were sculpted slightly open to allow the wearer to speak and smoke. These masks were technological marvels and psychological necessities, but they were also profoundly unsettling objects. They weighed as much as 3 pounds, heavy enough to cause discomfort over extended wear. The paint eventually flaked and discolored, requiring maintenance and periodic replacement. Most disturbing was the mask's unchanging expression, a fixed representation of youth and health that could not age with its wearer, could not smile or frown or show emotion, a permanent reminder of the living face that had been lost. Some men wore their masks constantly, at home as well as in public, never showing their injuries even to family members. The masks became their faces, and in doing so, perhaps, became their prisons. The discipline that emerged from this work anaplastology, the art and science of restoring absent or malformed anatomy through artificial means, was shaped fundamentally by the First World War. So too was modern plastic and reconstructive surgery, which grew from Gillies' innovations at Sidcup and Joseph's experiments in Berlin into a recognized medical specialty. The principles developed during those years, the use of pedicle flaps, the transplantation of cartilage and bone, the integration of dental and surgical treatment for jaw reconstruction, remain in use today. Dr. Shahid Aziz, a contemporary maxillofacial surgeon who has studied the medical records from that era, observes, because there was such a volume of injuries, it laid down the foundations for facial reconstructions and created new ways of thinking about how to handle them. Anesthesia for facial trauma evolved. New instrumentation was designed. Some of the techniques we're still using today. Yet this medical progress came at a cost that extends beyond the suffering of individual patients. Nurse Catherine Black quoted in medical histories of the period, noted the bitter irony. The Great War, in which millions of lives were sacrificed, was indirectly responsible for saving millions of others. Advances in surgical technique, anesthesia, blood transfusion, and wound management enabled doctors to save soldiers who would have died in earlier conflicts. But these same advances also worked to prolong the war itself. Armies could return wounded men to the battlefield more quickly, maintaining troop strength that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of casualties. Medical historian Lindsay Fitzharris describes the double-edged nature of this progress. It was awful for the nurses and the doctors to work on these men for months, sometimes years, send them back to the front, and then find out they died from some other kinds of injuries. The men themselves became symbols not of glory, not of triumph, but of endurance and the price of survival. In 1938, French director Abel Gance included actual facially mutilated veterans in his film Jacques Joseph, forcing audiences to confront what many had spent 2 decades trying to forget. In 1917, a delegation of gueules cassées had been invited by French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau to attend the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, living testimony to the human cost of the war and the necessity of lasting peace. Their presence at that ceremony, their broken faces visible among the diplomats and military officers, was meant to serve as warning and remembrance. The photograph of the German soldier, his face torn away by artillery, his profile revealing the catastrophic destruction of soft tissue and bone, belongs to this history. It is not a portrait of a man, but a document of transformation, a record of the moment when warfare became industrialized and the human body became raw material for machines designed to kill. The soldier's injury was not unique. Tens of thousands suffered similar wounds. Tens of thousands returned home to sit on blue benches, to wear copper masks, to endure the stares and whispers of civilians who could not reconcile the horror of their appearance with the sacrifice they represented. The soldier's injury was not exceptional, but it was particular. His face, his identity, his life reduced to an image that circulates now as evidence of what was done and what was learned. Harold Gillies wrote in 1920 that plastic surgery aims for humanity before beauty. It was a principle born of necessity, of working with tissues that would never fully heal, of attempting to give men back not the faces they had possessed, but faces sufficient to allow them to live. Jacques Joseph, working in parallel in Germany, understood that the restoration of appearance was not vanity but survival, that a man who could not show his face could not participate in society, could not work, could not love, could not exist as fully human. The masks created by Anna Coleman Ladd and Frances Derwent Wood, for all their limitations, represented an acknowledgement of this truth, that identity resides in the face. That to be seen is to be recognized. That to be recognized is to belong. The Union des Blesses d'Ailly Face et d'Ailité, founded by the gueules cassées themselves, still exists today, now operating under the shortened name Gueules Cassées, with the motto Sourire quand même, smiling nonetheless. It is a motto of defiance and acceptance, a recognition that survival requires more than the body's continuation, that healing extends beyond the physical. The organization's continued existence, more than a century after the war's end, suggests that the work begun by Gillies and Joseph and Ladd remains incomplete, that the reconstruction of the broken face is also the reconstruction of the social body, the slow and difficult process of learning to see suffering without turning away. The steel helmet, introduced in 1915, saved lives by reducing fatal head injuries by 75%. But for every life saved, there was often a face destroyed. And in this paradox lies the essential character of technological progress in modern warfare, that protection and vulnerability exist in simultaneous relationship. That to survive is not necessarily to be made whole. The German soldier in the photograph survived the moment of injury. He survived the extraction from the trench, the transport to the aid station, the surgery that stabilized his wounds, the months or years of attempted reconstruction. But what kind of survival was this? What life awaited him beyond the hospital walls, beyond the photographer's lens that captured his image and made it permanent? We do not know his name. We do not know if he returned to family, to work, to any semblance of the life he had known before. September 1916. We know only the image, the profile that shows where his face had been, the surgical reconstruction that created a functional but profoundly altered appearance, the evidence written in scar tissue, in displacement of what artillery can do to human flesh. The image circulates now as a historical document, a teaching tool, a reminder. It is seen by surgeons studying the evolution of reconstructive techniques, by historians documenting the social consequences of industrial warfare, by descendants trying to understand what their grandfathers endured and could not speak about. The First World War produced 10 million dead and 19 million wounded. Of these, 10 million were classified as mutilated, permanently disabled by injuries that destroyed limbs, organs, faces, the architecture of the body itself. France lost 1 in every 25 of its inhabitants. Germany lost 1 in 30. Britain 1 in 57. But statistics cannot capture the particular quality of facial disfigurement, the way it destroys not merely function, but recognition, not merely the body, but the self. The gueules cassées understood this. They fought for recognition as disabled veterans, not because they sought pensions, though they needed those too, but because they sought acknowledgement that what had been taken from them mattered, that the face is not merely decoration but essence, that to be faceless is to be unmade. The surgical and artistic innovations born from this crisis-tubed pedicle flaps, cartilage transplantation, prosthetic masks painted to match skin tone represented humanity's attempt to repair what its own weapons had destroyed. Harold Gillies performed 11,000 operations in 8 years, each one a negotiation between what was possible and what was necessary, between function and form, between the limits of tissue and the requirements of society. Jacques Joseph received the Iron Cross, not for killing but for healing, for taking the shattered faces of German soldiers and reconstructing them into forms that could be shown in public, that could be touched by wives, that could be recognized by children. Anna Coleman Ladd sculpted copper faces for French and American soldiers, creating masks that allowed them to walk through Paris without causing pedestrians to recoil, to sit in cafes without being asked to leave, to exist in public space as citizens rather than monsters. These were acts of compassion performed at the intersection of medicine, art, and desperate necessity. They saved lives not by preventing death, but by making survival bearable. They created a body of knowledge that surgeons would build upon for the next century, developing techniques that now serve not only war casualties, but cancer patients, burn victims, individuals born with congenital deformities, anyone whose face has been damaged or absent and requires reconstruction. The ethical principle that Jacques Joseph articulated, that cosmetic surgery, while not physically necessary, is worth the risks because of its impact on the human spirit, has become foundational to the practice of reconstructive medicine. But beneath the medical progress and the humanitarian impulse lies a darker truth that the photograph makes unavoidable. This should not have happened. The industrial capacity that produced machine guns firing 600 rounds per minute, that manufactured artillery shells by the millions, that created high explosive munitions designed to fragment into thousands of flesh-tearing shards, was the same industrial capacity that built railroads and factories and cities. The scientific knowledge that allowed engineers to calculate explosive yields and projectile velocities was the same knowledge that advanced medicine and agriculture and communication. The technological progress that defined the early 20th century was not separate from the war's carnage. It was the war's enabling condition. The broken faces were not accidents or unfortunate side effects. They were the logical outcome of applying industrial methods to the ancient practice of organized killing. The soldier in the photograph did not choose this. He was conscripted or enlisted, trained to follow orders, sent to the trenches because his nation's leaders determined that territorial or ideological or economic interests required military force. He raised his head above the parapet because tactics demanded observation, because attacks required exposure, because the nature of trench warfare made such moments necessary. The shell fragment that struck him was not aimed artillery fired indiscriminately, saturating areas with explosives, relying on volume rather than precision. The injury was random in its particularity, but inevitable in its occurrence. When hundreds of thousands of men live in trenches and millions of shells are fired, the arithmetic guarantees that faces will be destroyed. What Gillies and Joseph and Ladd accomplished was to push back against this arithmetic, to assert that the destruction of the face is not the destruction of the person. That surgical skill and artistic craft can restore enough of what was lost to allow a man to continue. Their work represented a form of resistance, not against the war itself, which they could not stop, but against the war's claim on the totality of its victims' existence. The girls cassées who survived and formed their association, who attended the Treaty of Versailles signing, who continued to advocate for recognition and support throughout the 1920s and 1930s and beyond, were engaged in the same resistance. They refused to disappear, refused to hide, refused to accept that their disfigurement made them less than human. The blue benches, the hospital uniforms worn as warnings, the masks that allowed anonymous passage through public spaces, these were accommodations to a society that found the broken face unbearable to witness. But they were also, perhaps, temporary measures, intermediate steps in a longer process of adjustment and acceptance. The Union des Blesses de la Face et de la Tête still exists, with its motto Sourire quand même, suggesting that the work of integration continues, that the social reconstruction of the facially disfigured is ongoing, that each generation must learn again not to turn away. The photograph endures as testimony. The German soldier's face, or what remains of it, is preserved in the emulsion and chemistry of early 20th century photography, replicated and circulated, made available for viewing by anyone with access to historical archives or internet databases. The image is difficult to look at. The impulse to avert one's eyes, to scroll past, to close the browser window, is the same impulse that led to the blue benches and the painted copper masks. But to look away is to refuse the testimony, to deny what was done and what was learned. The soldier's injury is evidence of artillery's destructive power, of industrial warfare's capacity to unmake the human form, of the gap between technological capability and ethical constraint. It is also evidence of survival, of medical innovation, of the possibility that even catastrophic loss can be addressed, if imperfectly, through skill and care and determination. Harold Gillies trained surgeons from Commonwealth nations in his techniques, ensuring that the knowledge developed at Sidcup would spread to medical centers around the world. Jacques Joseph's work on reconstructive surgery became foundational texts for the emerging specialty of plastic surgery, studied by physicians in multiple languages across multiple continents. The discipline of anaplastology, pioneered by Wood and Ladd, evolved into a recognized field that today employs sophisticated materials and digital modeling to create prosthetics of remarkable verisimilitude. The medical advances born from the First World War's epidemic of facial trauma serve patients worldwide, addressing injuries and conditions that have nothing to do with warfare, but everything to do with the human, need to be seen and recognized. Yet, this legacy is inseparable from its origin in mass violence. The 10 million dead and 19 million wounded of the First World War created the conditions that made innovation necessary and experimentation possible. The 5,000 patients treated by Gillies at Sidcup were 5,000 data points, 5,000 opportunities to develop and refine surgical techniques, 5,000 human beings whose suffering became the foundation for medical knowledge. The ethical complexity of this cannot be resolved. We cannot say that the war's medical advances justified its carnage, that calculus is obscene. But neither can we ignore that the advances occurred, that they continue to serve suffering patients, that the knowledge extracted from catastrophe has positive applications. We are left with paradox, that good can emerge from evil, that healing can arise from wounding, that the worst impulses of human nature can generate, as unintended consequence, methods for addressing human suffering. The German soldier in the photograph stands unknowingly at this intersection. His injury represents the culmination of industrial warfare's capacity for destruction. His treatment, whatever surgical interventions he received, whatever prosthetics he may have worn, whatever accommodations he made to his altered appearance, represents the beginning of reconstructive medicine as a systematic discipline. He was both victim and patient, both casualty and case study, both broken face and pioneer. His image circulates now without his consent, captured and preserved and distributed in ways he could not have imagined. We look at him across more than a century, across technological revolutions and social transformations, and we see both what was done and what was learned. The steel helmet saved lives, but created survivors who bore their injuries visibly, who could not be ignored or forgotten or absorbed back into civilian life without disruption. The girls' cassées insisted on being seen, on being counted, on being recognized as both wounded and whole, damaged and deserving, disfigured and human. The surgeons and artists who worked to reconstruct them understood, perhaps, that their task was not merely technical, but existential, that to restore a face, however imperfectly, was to restore a place in the human community, to make possible the continuation of a life that war had nearly ended. This is what Harold Gillies meant when he wrote that he aimed for humanity before beauty, that the goal was not perfection, but sufficiency, not restoration of what had been, but creation of what could be, given the limitations of tissue and technique and time. The photograph does not show us the man's eyes. We cannot see his expression, cannot know what he thought or felt when the camera captured his image. We see only the profile, the evidence of injury and intervention, the permanent alteration of the face that once belonged to a young German soldier in September 1916. The image is clinical, documentary, intended perhaps for medical records or teaching purposes. But it is also intimate, exposing vulnerability that in civilian life would be private. The soldier has no say in how we interpret his image, no control over the contexts in which it appears, no ability to narrate his own experience. He is silent, reduced to evidence, made symbol of a war that killed millions and wounded millions more. Yet in this silence there is a kind of speech. The photograph says, "This happened." The photograph says, "This is what war does." The photograph says, "Survival sometimes looks like this, and we must find ways to accommodate it, to heal it, to make it possible." The girls' cassées understood this. Their organization's motto sourire conned meme. Smiling nonetheless is not optimism but determination. Not denial but acceptance of what cannot be changed, coupled with insistence that life continues. That meaning persists, that the broken face remains a face, and the person behind it remains a person. We have inherited the knowledge born from their suffering. Contemporary reconstructive surgery, maxillofacial medicine, anaplastology. and multiple related disciplines trace their lineage directly to the innovations developed between 1914 and 1918. Surgeons today use techniques that Gillies pioneered at Sidcup, principles that Joseph articulated at the Carite, methods refined through thousands of operations on men whose faces had been destroyed by artillery. This knowledge serves burn victims, cancer patients, accident survivors, individuals born with craniofacial malformations, people who have no connection to military conflict, but who benefit from techniques developed in response to warfare's injuries. The German soldier in the photograph, like the thousands of other gueules cassées, contributed unwillingly to this legacy. His face, destroyed and partially reconstructed, became part of the archive of human knowledge about trauma and healing. There is no redemption in this. The soldier would surely have preferred to keep his face, to avoid the shell fragment that struck him in September 1916, to live an ordinary life unmarked by catastrophic injury. The medical advances that emerge from his suffering and the suffering of tens of thousands, like him, do not justify the war that caused those injuries. But the advances exist, and they continue to serve humanity. And in this persistence, there is perhaps a form of meaning, not purpose, not justification, but meaning nonetheless. The gueules cassées insisted on this meaning when they formed their association, when they attended the Treaty of Versailles, when they adopted as their motto the determination to smile despite everything. They claimed the right to exist not as victims or monsters, but as citizens, as men who had served and suffered and survived and demanded recognition. The photograph, like the blue benches and the copper masks and the surgical records from Sidcup and the Carite, is a document of this demand. It shows us what most would prefer not to see: the face destroyed, the person altered, the cost of survival made visible. To look at the photograph is to accept responsibility for seeing, for acknowledging what was done, for understanding that the broken face belongs to a person who endured what we have been spared. This is not easy. The impulse to avert one's eyes is natural, perhaps even appropriate a recognition that suffering deserves privacy, that vulnerability should not be exploited. But the photograph exists in public archives, circulates in historical texts, appears in educational materials precisely because the gueules cassées and those who treated them understood that silence serves no one. That horror hidden becomes horror repeated. The First World War ended in November 1918. The soldiers with broken faces continued their treatments for years. Afterward, Gillies performed surgeries at Sidcup until 1925, working on patients long after the armistice had been signed. The Union des Blessés de la Face et de la Tête continued its advocacy through the interwar period, through the Second World War, through the decades of the 20th century, transforming eventually into the organization that exists today. The techniques developed by Gillies and Joseph were refined and expanded, incorporated into medical curricula, adapted to new technologies and materials. The discipline of plastic surgery, barely existent in 1914, became by mid-century a recognized specialty with its own training programs, professional associations, and research journals. Anaplastology evolved from the work of sculptors, creating copper masks to a sophisticated field employing silicone and digital modeling to produce prosthetics nearly indistinguishable from living tissue. The German soldier in the photograph participated, however involuntarily, in this evolution. His injury was documented, his treatment recorded, his image preserved as part of the archive that surgeons studied to understand what was possible and what was necessary. He was among the first generation of men for whom facial reconstruction was attempted on a systematic basis, for whom surgery was not merely life-saving, but life-making, creating the physical possibility of continued existence in social space. Whether this was sufficient, whether the reconstructed face allowed him to work, to marry, to raise children, to live with dignity, we cannot know. The photograph shows us only one moment, clinical and exposing, revealing the extent of damage and the attempt at repair. But in that single moment is contained the larger story of industrial warfare's capacity for destruction, of medical innovation born from necessity, of social struggle for recognition and inclusion, of the human determination to survive and be seen. The girls' cassées with their motto sourire, con mean smiling nonetheless, represent this determination. They refuse to be erased, refuse to hide, refuse to accept that disfigurement made them less than human. Their insistence created space for Gillies' surgical innovations, for Joseph's reconstructive techniques, for Ladd's prosthetic masks, for the gradual social accommodation of the broken face. Their insistence continues to resonate in contemporary disability rights movements. In medical ethics discussions about quality of life and patient autonomy, in ongoing debates about how societies address visible difference, the photograph endures because it documents a transformation, not only of the soldier's face, but of our understanding of injury, survival, and healing. Before the First World War, facial disfigurement on this scale was unprecedented. Medical science had no systematic response. Society had no framework for integration, and the disfigured themselves had no collective voice. After the war, all of this had changed. Plastic surgery existed as a discipline. Anaplastology had emerged as a field. Veterans organizations represented the interests of the facially wounded. Blue benches and warning uniforms, however problematic, acknowledged that these men existed and required accommodation. The soldier in the photograph stands at this threshold, between the old world that could not imagine such injuries and the new world that had learned, however reluctantly, to address them. We look at him now with knowledge he could not have, possessed knowledge of how the surgical techniques applied to his case would evolve, how the social attitudes toward disfigurement would shift, how the discipline of reconstructive medicine would develop. We know what he could not, that his suffering, and the suffering of the girls' cassées who survived alongside him, would eventually serve others, would create knowledge and techniques that benefit people who have no connection to warfare, but who need what Gillies and Joseph and their successors learned. This knowledge does not erase his pain, does not justify the artillery shell that struck him, does not make beautiful what was destroyed. But it suggests that even from catastrophe, even from the industrialized violence that produced 10 million dead and 19 million wounded, something can be salvaged, not redemption, not justification, but possibility. The possibility that the broken face can be addressed. The possibility that survival need not mean permanent isolation. The possibility that medical skill and artistic craft can restore enough of what was lost to make continued life feasible. The possibility that those who suffer visible injury can find recognition and support rather than only rejection and horror. These possibilities were not guaranteed. They emerged from the specific historical conjunction of industrial warfare, medical innovation, artistic intervention, and collective political action by the girls' cassées themselves. They remain fragile, requiring constant affirmation through practice and policy and cultural attitude. The German soldier in the photograph reminds us of this fragility. His face destroyed by artillery in September 1916, partially reconstructed through surgery, preserved in photographic emulsion shows us both the worst that humans can do to one another and the best that humans can do in response. The artillery shell represents organized violence, the application of industrial capacity to the ancient practice of warfare, the willingness to destroy faces and bodies and lives in pursuit of military objectives. The surgical reconstruction represents organized compassion, the application of medical knowledge to the repair of catastrophic injury, the willingness to experiment and innovate in service of healing. Both are distinctly human capacities. Both were present in the First World War. Both remain present today, that we cannot undo what was done to the German soldier. His face is gone, destroyed in 3 seconds of exposure above a trench in September 1916. What remains is the photograph, the testimony, the evidence that this happened and that it matters. The girls' cassées insisted it matters. Gillies and Joseph and Ladd demonstrated through their work that it matters. The continued existence of plastic surgery, of anaplastology, of veterans' organizations advocating for the facially injured, affirms that it matters. Each time a contemporary surgeon uses a tubed pedicle flap to reconstruct a cancer patient's face. Each time a prosthetic mask helps a burn victim reintegrate into society. Each time a person with facial difference finds accommodation rather than rejection. The legacy of the girls' cassées is renewed. Their suffering unwanted, catastrophic. The result of violence they did not choose becomes part of the ongoing project of healing, of making survival possible, of asserting that the broken face remains a face and the person behind it remains fully human. This is not redemption. This is not justification. This is simply what happened. From catastrophe came knowledge. From suffering came technique. From rejection came determination to be seen. The German soldier in the photograph participated in this transformation without choosing it, without controlling it, without being able to narrate his own experience. We are left with the image, with the historical record, with the legacy of medical advances and social changes that trace their origin to his injury, and the injuries of tens of thousands like him. We are left, too, with the responsibility to look, to acknowledge, to remember that beneath every medical technique is a patient who suffered, that every advance in reconstructive surgery represents not only innovation, but also the catastrophic destruction that made innovation necessary. The photograph asks us to hold these truths simultaneously. That war destroys, that medicine heals, that survival is complicated, that the face is both tissue and identity, that what is broken can sometimes be partially restored, but never fully recovered. The girls' cassées understood this. Their motto sourire quand même, smiling nonetheless, contains no illusion that their faces will be restored to what they were. No promise that society will fully accommodate their difference. No assurance that their suffering served any higher purpose. It contains only determination to continue, to insist on being seen, to smile despite everything. This determination created space for Gillies' surgical innovations, for Joseph's reconstructive techniques, for Ladd's prosthetic masks, for the gradual development of medical and social responses to facial trauma. This determination continues wherever people with visible injuries or differences assert their right to exist in public space, to be seen without being stared at, to be recognized as fully human despite disfigurement. The German soldier in the photograph, his face destroyed and partially reconstructed, stands as testimony to this determination. We do not know if he smiled. We do not know if he integrated back into civilian life, if he found work or family, or any semblance of normalcy after September 1916. We know only that his image survives, that it circulates as evidence and instruction, that it asks us to see what most would prefer to ignore. To look at the photograph is to accept what it shows, that this happened, that it can happen again, that the industrial capacity for destruction coexists with the human capacity for healing, that survival sometimes requires the courage to be seen when one's face has been destroyed. The girls' cassées demonstrated this courage. Their legacy is not merely medical technique, but also social insistence, the refusal to disappear, the determination to be recognized, the assertion that the broken face belongs to a person deserving of dignity and care. This legacy persists wherever people confront visible difference without turning away, wherever medical practitioners work to restore not merely function, but also the possibility of being seen. Wherever societies create space for those whose appearance violates expectations of normalcy, the First World War produced the conditions that made this legacy necessary. 10 million dead, 19 million wounded, 10 million mutilated, 15,000 broken faces in France alone. These numbers are not abstractions. They represent individual human beings, each with a name and a face and a life disrupted or destroyed by artillery, machine guns, poison gas, all the instruments of industrialized killing. The German soldier in the photograph is one among millions. His injury specific, but not unique. His suffering individual, but part of a collective catastrophe. What makes his image significant is not its uniqueness, but its representation. It shows us what happened to faces when they encountered 20th century weapons. It documents the beginning of systematic medical response. It preserves visual evidence of trauma that most contemporaries preferred not to see. The photograph is uncomfortable to view. It should be. Comfort in the presence of such injury would represent a failure of empathy, a dulling of appropriate human response to suffering. The discomfort is the point. It reminds us that this should not have happened, that nothing justifies the destruction of the soldier's face, that even the medical advances that emerge from treating such injuries cannot redeem the violence that caused them. Yet the discomfort must not lead to avoidance. The blue benches were mechanisms of avoidance, allowing civilians to prevent encounters with disfigured soldiers, maintaining the illusion that war leaves only honored, dead, and heroic, wounded rather than broken faces that persist and demand accommodation. The girls' cassées rejected this avoidance, insisting on visibility and recognition. To look at the photograph is to honor this insistence, to acknowledge that the soldier's injury matters, that his survival matters, that his treatment by surgeons like Gillies and Joseph contributed to knowledge that continues to serve humanity. This acknowledgement does not erase his suffering, but it recognizes that his suffering was not meaningless, not because it served any purpose he would have chosen, but because the medical and social responses it prompted have had lasting impact. The German soldier in the photograph is silent. He cannot tell us what he experienced, what he felt, what his life became after September 1916. We are left with interpretation, with historical context, with the testimony of surgeons and nurses and other girls' cassées who documented their experiences. We are left with the knowledge that facial disfigurement in the First World War created an epidemic of social isolation, psychological trauma, and attempted suicide among those who survived. We are left with the knowledge that pioneers like Gillies and Joseph developed techniques that reduced this isolation, that made survival more bearable, that gave men back enough of their faces to allow them to exist in public space. We are left with the knowledge that organizations like the Union des Blesses de la Face et de la Tête fought for recognition and support, transforming scattered individual suffering into collective political action. And we are left with the photograph itself, evidence that all of this was necessary, that the broken face was not rare, exception but common reality of industrialized warfare. This is the legacy. Medical knowledge extracted from catastrophe. Social movements born from collective suffering. Ongoing debates about how to accommodate visible difference. The German soldier in the photograph contributed involuntarily to this legacy. His face, destroyed and partially reconstructed, became part of the archive that surgeons studied, the evidence that inspired innovation, the testimony that motivated advocacy. He was both victim and pioneer, both casualty and case study, both broken face and human being. The photograph collapses these categories, showing us simultaneously the extent of his injury and the fact of his survival, the catastrophic destruction and the beginning of repair. To look at the photograph is to hold all of this in mind, the violence that caused the injury, the skill that addressed it, the society that struggled to accommodate it, the person who endured it all. The girls' cassées with their motto Sourire Condamine smiling nonetheless remind us that survival is an active choice, not a passive state. They chose to insist on recognition, to form organizations, to advocate for themselves and others like them. They chose to attend the Treaty of Versailles signing, presenting their broken faces as testimony to war's cost and the necessity of peace. They chose visibility over hiding, collective action over isolated suffering. These choices created possibilities that did not exist before: the possibility of reconstructive surgery covered by veterans' benefits, the possibility of prosthetic masks sophisticated enough to allow social reintegration, the possibility of living with facial disfigurement without complete isolation. These possibilities emerged from specific historical circumstances: the catastrophic scale of facial injuries in the First World War, the presence of innovative surgeons like Gillies and Joseph, the determination of the gueules cassées themselves to be seen and heard. But once established, these possibilities became part of the larger human repertoire of responses to trauma, available to others who face similar challenges, even in entirely different contexts. The German soldier in the photograph stands at the origin of these possibilities. His injury was among the first generation of facial wounds, addressed through systematic reconstructive surgery. His treatment contributed to the development of techniques still in use today. His image circulates as testimony to what was done and what was learned. He did not choose any of this, not the war, not the injury, not the documentation, not the legacy. But his involuntary participation in history had consequences that extend far beyond his individual experience. Every patient who benefits from reconstructive surgery, every person with facial difference who finds accommodation in society, every advocate who works to destigmatize visible injury, inherits something from the gueules cassées and the surgeons and artists who work to address their suffering. This inheritance is not simple. It is shadowed by the violence that made it necessary, compromised by its origin in catastrophe, complicated by the ongoing presence of warfare and facial trauma in contemporary life. But it is real, and it matters, and it persists. The photograph documents this complexity. The German soldier's face destroyed, reconstructed, preserved shows us that human capacity for both destruction and healing, that historical events have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate moment, that suffering can generate knowledge without being redeemed by it. To look at the photograph is to accept responsibility for seeing, for acknowledging, for understanding that the broken face belongs to a person, that the person deserves recognition, that recognition requires us to confront what we would prefer to avoid. The gueules cassées demanded this recognition. The photograph continues to make this demand, silently, persistently, across more than a century of distance from the moment of injury to our present act of viewing. We cannot give the German soldier back his face. We can only see what remains, acknowledge what was lost, understand that his survival and the survival of tens of thousands like him required innovations in medicine, shifts in social attitudes, and determined political advocacy. We can only recognize that this legacy persists, that it continues to shape how we respond to trauma, that it reminds us that the broken face remains a face, and the person behind it remains fully, irreducibly human.